What is PI planning? It is the seminal event in any SAFe implementation. It is a critical component that brings so many of the SAFe principles together, aligning cadence and synchronization, it brings a number of Agile manifesto principles together. And its intention is to understand our objectives and our approach, our direction for this upcoming PI. And keep in mind that we do PI planning before the PI. So if you're in sequence, if you're in like PI 6, you're doing PI planning for 7 at the end of 6. So it takes place at the end. And what it's doing is looking at the opportunities we have in front of us and what makes sense for how we're going to get there. Now, there's a number of different quotes. This is a quote from Dean Leffingwell. There's no magic in SAFe except maybe for PI planning. And he's right. When I first got involved with SAFe in 2012, and I did the simulation, if any of you have attended SPC class, you know the simulation we do. Hasn't changed all that much over the years. When you do the simulation, it dawned on me, oh my gosh, this is an opportunity for team members to voice their concerns, raise their ideas. It's an opportunity to align with business, to get people all on the same page. That's why it's such a critical component to any SAFe implementation. So here's the goal that we have today. I want to describe some of the best practices. And by describing these, I've got these set up as tips. Now, all of these tips are in line with SAFe guidance, but they're not necessarily covered in SAFe guidance articles. In other words, I may be in diving deeper, giving more clarity, adding more substance to it, a number of different ways to expand beyond. But just note that none of these are against SAFe practices or guidance. They're just better elaborating those. Here's what we're trying to avoid is this. How many of you are doing PI planning right now remotely? Just go ahead and hit the Zoom, raise your hand. Okay, you probably get some of this where, oh my gosh, this is so boring. I'm just, okay. You paying attention? Yeah, I'm paying attention as I'm playing solitaire or Warcraft or something like that, right? We want to unlock the intrinsic motivation, principle number 8 from SAFe. And the way we do that is to make this engaging, to make this what I call a discovery session. This should be an opportunity to bring people together and collectively discover what the plan is for the next PI. And it's the opposite of this. If you haven't seen the Work Chronicles, I recommend you subscribe. The author has some great strips here. This one I thought was just really perfect. This 1 hour meeting, I have 210 slides. We all moan at that. It's all filled with paragraphs of text, and I'm now about to start reading every single word for word. That's the opposite of what we want. We want interactive, engaged conversations. We want people coming to this excited, happy to be there because we're going to learn a ton. We're going to discover a ton. Okay, with that being said, let's jump into the first tip. And by the way, all of these tips have come from my experience over the years in launching arts, in coming in and helping arts that have been up and running for a while that are really struggling. And it's my terminology, my phrasing, if you will, of encapsulating the key ideas behind it. And the first one I call breadth versus depth. And what that means is when we start planning, so if you go into the PI planning session in the morning, depending on how you do the schedule, you might separate it over days, whatever. But we have that first section that's the briefings. Those should be engaged, but they are presentations. They are, okay, teams, arts, here's what we have in store. Here's what we're trying to solve. Now, that should not be a surprise. The team members should have already seen these at some high level, had some conversations and so forth, but not completely broken them down. They understand what's there. And so what happens is we have engaged, informed conversations during the briefings. Then the teams take over. And now they start to break things down to create a plan. And here's the key. Start with a high level end-to-end plan. That's what I mean by breadth versus depth. I always tell teams within an hour, I want you to have a really sketchy, full of holes, end-to-end plan. Well, how do I do that? Well, come up with a few stories, which will lead to some objectives. We'll see some of this later. But I want you to start getting that really high level plan of how we're getting from beginning to end. And then we can go back later and fill it in. The guarantee then is that by the end of the first breakout, we have a draft plan. We always have a plan to review. How filled out it is, how many assumptions it has, that's based on the context. But we always have a plan to review. The last thing you want, and the anti-pattern I see quite often, is we go to the draft plan review, and first team has the first two iterations planned to detail and nothing else. No objectives, no risks, no dependencies. Ouch, that's not a plan. It's a draft plan. We call it a draft plan for a reason. It's drafty. It should have assumptions in it. Principle number 3 from SAFE, assume variability, preserve options. This is about starting with those minimal constraints and then getting that high level approach. And as that cone of uncertainty narrows, as we have conversations, we talk and move forward, we learn more, we refine and fill those things in. And that's where principle number 3, one of the key areas that it's used, is to make sure that we do that breadth versus depth. Let's start with this high level understanding of where we're going, and team to team, business owner to team members, product management, and so on. We're able to look at it and say, okay, what is it we're trying to accomplish? And do we start to see a picture of how this is going to happen? Now, one of the keys to that is start with that high level end-to-end plan. As I said, sorry, this is the first time I've done this kind of presentation with a Miro board, so hopefully this is working well for you. But start with that high level end-to-end plan, and yes, it will have holes in it. And sometimes teams get concerned about that. It does take a little time for them to get used to it. But then as we move along, we can go back and fill in those gaps. We can answer some of those questions as we continue the conversations during the rest of the first breakout into the second breakout. Now, we end up with a plan. Yes, it's still a draft plan. Even on day 2, it still has some assumptions, some gaps, things like that. But what we're saying is, based on what we currently know, this is our plan. Now, the one thing we know about a plan coming out of PI planning, it will change. Guaranteed. It's wrong. And that's okay. It's okay because it's enough for us to get started and start learning. And we'll find those adjustment opportunities. We'll find those times that we can, we thought we'd go this direction, but we really need to go this direction. That's okay. That's exactly what we want, is we want to have a plan to leave it high level enough that we can continue on, that we can adjust and learn as we go. Okay, just a reminder, I'm going to go on to the next tip. If you have any comments, thoughts, up here in Miro, if you're not familiar with it, you can just grab a sticky note and you can just paste a sticky note anywhere with your comment, question, whatever it is you'd like to put there. All right, let's go on to tip 2. This one, I've had a number of different names for it because I've always struggled with what should I call it. And it settled on start objectives early. What I started off saying is objectives should be messily written. They should be confusing. They should be abstract as we get started. But then as we start to learn and we start to figure things out, we get those objectives out right away. So here's the first thing. Start writing those objectives early on. When we first start our breakout session, our goal is to start getting high level, really rough objectives right away. Let's not wait. Let's start getting something up there right away. Then as we learn more, we go back to those objectives and we start crossing this word out, changing this, adding this, updating this, and the objective emerges. Rather than trying to go towards the end and write a perfect objective the first time, which never happens, we instead start high level and we go back and fill it in as we go, as we learn more. Team objectives. This is one of the most difficult things for teams to initially understand in SAFE is what our team objectives. And I use this analogy. Think of objectives, think of features as chapters in a book. Let's say you just read a really good book and you want to go share it to someone. Wow, I just read Reinertson's Principles of Product Development Flow. And here's the key things that stood out to me. Well, another team, another person, read the exact same book, and they want to have a conversation with someone. They're probably bringing up different components, different things, because as they read the book, different things stood out to them. And that's what I recommend is teams read all the features and understand what's in there, and then they determine what part they have to play. Now, there's a little hidden tip in here that's really important. In SAFe, features are never written for teams. They're written to solve a problem, to capture an opportunity, never directed at a team. Features are not there to keep teams busy. It's to take advantage of an opportunity. And so as all of the teams read all the features, they're going, oh, that's a really cool opportunity. We don't have much to do with that. This one, boy, we'll probably have a lot to do with that. Hey, I think we might be able to collaborate on this one. And they come up with an understanding of how they're going to contribute. Now, as you're writing objectives during the breakout sessions, again, start as soon as you possibly can. In PI planning, during the first breakout, I want the first entry into that space where objectives are in 15 to 20 minutes. Yes, that quickly. And it might be 2 or 3 words. It might be something, a placeholder saying, hey, we're going to have to do this. Yes. Okay, that's good enough for now. That's all we need. We don't need smart objectives yet. We will get to that later. And as we continue to iterate through, we'll be able to populate those objectives, to flesh those out, to add fidelity to those. And as we do, that's when we start to get to the smart objectives. That's when we get specific and measurable. It's our end goal. It's not the starting line, it's the finish line. So remember that when we talk about smart objectives, it's a target, not the initial starting point. Now, one quick little tip for you. There's a blog out here from Sahil Penekar who put out a different format for objectives. And it's not that I'm saying, hey, this is what you should use. It's a really good way to think about it, though. And it incorporates the we intend concept from Captain David Marquet. So instead of stating the objective in kind of unformatted terms, instead we say, hey, by this point, maybe date, end of PI, whatever, we intend to do this. And here's the reason. So we get this outcome. And it'll be measured by, here's how we're going to measure it. That's where you're going to get really valuable objectives and talk about great conversations with business owners when they see this format. Incredibly powerful. Okay, I'm going to keep going. If there's any questions, you certainly can unmute as well if you're not familiar with Miro or you want to jump in. Tip number 3, what if scenarios. This is a challenging one for a lot of people. Here's the most common fear I see in teams in PI planning. They believe they are expected to create 4 iteration plans for a 5-iteration PI, and that they're committing to those 4 iterations. No, that's mini waterfall. Absolutely not. That's not what they're doing. The what if scenario concept is that we are creating the iteration plans only to discover the plan. That's one of many ways. Iteration plans are not committed to in PI planning. There are 2 things that teams commit to: the art planning board, which has features and dependencies, and the team objectives. And since team objectives are many to many, perhaps with features, the objectives are what the teams are committing to. And it raises it up a level. So we have a higher level target, which allows flexibility underneath. It allows that iteration plan to flex as we learn. In my experience, coming out of PI planning, iteration 1 is probably fairly accurate. I would say it's generally 80% accurate. These are rough numbers. Iteration 2, we're going to learn a lot in 1. So when we get to iteration 2, we're going to adjust some things. On average, iteration 2 is probably 60% accurate. And then you get to iteration 3 and 4, because there's so much learning in the iterations previous to it, Oftentimes iterations 3 and 4 are 40%, 30% accurate, and that's okay. That's just fine. The key thing that we're committing to is, hey, we've got these dependencies with this other team. That's changing because of things we've learned. Let's go talk to that team. That's the reason for the dependencies. But the rest can adjust underneath, because what we're really trying to deliver is the objectives. We're trying to solve these things that we committed to, which will lead to the features being delivered. Now, what this allows is teams to go, okay, so we're not being expected to commit to 4 iteration plans in a row. They don't have to be detailed and perfect and completely committed to, excuse me, absolutely not. Instead, they're committing to the objectives and the ARC planning board. That allows them to create real commitment. You cannot make 4 iteration plans in a row and honestly commit to it. You just can't do it. There's too much that will change. That's why I love this quote by Peter Drucker. Unless you can make a true commitment, there's only promises and hopes, but no plans. That we don't want hope as a strategy. We want a real plan that we can iterate on. Now, here's some of the benefits. We turn this into discoveries, because now we're diving in and saying, okay, this is a what if scenario. There's a lot of room for flexibility here. So let's really look at the dependencies. Let's look at the objectives. Let's figure out how we can deliver business value. There's far less time focus on detailed planning for each iteration. That can come later. That comes after PI planning is done, before we start. It comes in iteration planning before each iteration. We have time for that. So now the teams have time to focus on what we really want. So remember, the key here, I call these what if scenarios. The iteration plan that the team creates in PI planning, it's one of many possible ways that they could deliver on it. Yeah, it's a realistic plan. We have stories. We have capacity margins. We look at that and see, does this make sense? But the one thing that we know about it for sure, it will change, because we're going to learn things. So it's one of many possible ways that we can deliver on these objectives. We know it's going to change, and that's okay. That's all we need to know for now. Okay, if there are no questions, let's continue on to tip number 4. This one takes a bit to understand, but it's really powerful when used correctly. And I call it raise the levels evenly. In this one, what we're trying to do is say, don't focus on one area, complete it, and then go to the next and the next. And instead, what we want to do is do high level, a little bit here, a little here, a little here, a little here. And I'll show you this graphic. Hopefully my animation will work. We'll see if it does. It's not working. So this animation, what it's supposed to do is show you that, there we go, now it's working. We start to do some stories. That leads to some objectives. That leads to, oh, we found some risk. Oh, that leads to some dependencies. Hey, let's go update the ARC planning board. Oh, and we found some more stories. That leads to further refined objectives. Oh, we discovered more risks. There's more dependencies. Rinse and repeat. It's this layer approach that we want for planning. What we don't want to do is go in and try and discover every single story before we move on to objectives, before we move on to risks. Think of these as buckets, and you're putting a little bit in each bucket and then going back and repeating. And there's no particular order. If you start adding some stories, you discover some dependency, that leads to objective clarification, great. Just make sure that you're adding a little bit to each and then coming back and adding layers as you move along. So a little tip here. In doing so, this leads to really good clarity and helping get that end-to-end plan that I talked about earlier. It's a really good practice to make sure we're measuring this process, that we're looking at this process, this raising the levels evenly as we move along. So that when we get to, this is Scrum of Scrums, it's now called the Coach Sync. But when we get to the Coach Sync, that we're actually able to answer questions. The Scrum Masters can say, yeah, we're doing pretty well in these 3 areas, but we're having trouble discovering dependencies because the other team that we need, they're busy with something else. So we're going to have to coordinate some time, because that allows the coach sync when we're raising the levels evenly. We have clarity how the process is working across the board. Oh, we have some background noise here. It leads to a lot more clarity of how the process is working, how we're able to continue to planning as a team of teams. Without it, we go to Coach Sync, we don't know how it's going. What's your team doing? Oh, we're writing all the stories. Have you started writing the objectives? No, we're going to get to that later. We haven't tested the process. So keep testing that throughout. As I said, it takes a while to learn this practice. Use the Coach Sync. Use your coach and your Scrum Masters to keep recommending that, to keep reminding people we want to raise the levels evenly. That's where we can find these assumptions, these gaps, and so forth, the dangerous parts of the plan. Next one, tip 5. Preconceived is pre-committed. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of PI planning, is teams coming in with a pre-committed plan. They spend the IP iteration or the week before the PI planning. They spend that time looking at the features, determining what part they're going to play, and creating all of their stories, planning out the iterations so that they can come to PI planning all ready to present their plan, to give the readout. So many dangerous components here. Is now we come in with this mental block. Excuse me, we have this mental model of this is our plan. Quick story for you. Now, this came from a coach I was working with. I've done a lot of coaching coaches. This coach was working with this art. They had done PI planning 1, worked pretty good, came out pretty well. They're going into PI planning 2. Came in, did the briefings, went into the team breakout. One of the teams took out this large 3x5 plotted sheet. This was in person. And they pasted it up on the wall and said, we've already built our plan. We're good to go. And they sat down and started doing other work. Well, about 5 minutes in, there was another team that came over and said, hey, could you guys help us with this in iteration 2? Yeah, I think we could. They crossed out a couple stories, had another one in. Then another team came over, and another, and another. Within 30 minutes, this coach said they had just torn the sheet down and started from scratch. That's the danger of having this pre-committed plan. Now, there's a lot of conversations in the SAFE community about how much pre-planning is the right level. It varies organization to organization, but there's a really good quote in the RTE course that says, prepare for PI planning to maximize the amount of interactivity within the event. Not outside it, within it. That's a really powerful statement, because the way I see it, I want people coming in with intelligent, informed questions, not answers, questions. That's the right level of preparation that avoids this, because otherwise we get this problem. You get Batman and Superman against each other, that unstoppable force versus the immovable object from one team's plan to another one. That's the last thing we want. We want the teams to discover their plans together. This is a team of teams, not a collection of teams, not a group of teams. It's a team of teams. Set it up so that they feel comfortable and encouraged to create that plan together. This is a big part of the discovery process of PI planning. By the way, this ties directly into the what if scenario. The last key principle, and then I want to open it up for more conversation, maintain focus. Now, this is a newer one that I brought in here. Actually working with a good friend of mine, John Miller. We were talking about this. You know, there's one of these that we're missing, is maintaining focus. PI planning is 16 hours, the equivalent of it. Keeping your focus during that time is absolutely critical. Focusing on what the objectives are, what we're trying to accomplish. And again, we want to walk out the door or shut off the Zoom, whatever, at the end of that 16 hours with a direction. That's what we're looking for. A direction that has been somewhat vetted because, yeah, we discovered we've got some dependencies to this other team. We might have to deal with these risks. Those might be an issue. Hey, we think we're going to have these features delivered at this time. That's what it looks like now, but it relies on these dependencies across teams. That's what we're looking for. So making sure we get the focus on the right things is critical. And my friend John had a statement, I'll talk about it in a bit. He said, have a WIP limit of 1. And we'll talk about that in a bit. That's a really important part. Those of you that know me before know that I'm nuts about motorcycles. So I wanted to bring this in about when I coach road racers, because I coach them not to do what you're seeing on the screen, but to maintain it, keep it upright. The very first reason that we crash, lack of focus. I can attest to that because I was in Morocco at the end of November and just starting to get the hang of riding on really rough, rocky, mountainous roads. And I came around a corner, lost focus, crashed, broken leg. Lack of focus is it's the most common issue from road racing, as well as having problems in PI planning. So how do we avoid that? Have those early discussions, team and business owner, get them involved in the business value on PI objectives that reduces the risk of misalignment. Those business value, those objectives, having business value is critical. And having the conversation early, as you probably are aware, Scaled Agile recommends that during the second breakout, day 2 if you're on the calendar dates, about the middle of the second breakout, we get the business owners to go around team to team and have a conversation about their objectives and what business value, number 1 to 10, do the business owners think that would deliver. Start having those conversations early. Don't wait until the middle of the second breakout. Get business owner when the objectives start to surface, get them over right away and say, hey, we're working on this objective. It's still really rough, but here's what we're thinking. What are your thoughts? Oh yeah, it's not specific enough that I could give it a business value, but I do see a lot of merit in it, but I'm a little concerned about this. Have that conversation and continue to have those conversations. And that's where this WIP limit of 1 comes in, keeping the team focused. We are all together doing this. If we are adding stories, we're all adding stories. If we're writing objectives, if we're updating those, we're all working, collaborating, contributing to that. If we're talking dependencies, hey, a couple of us are going and talking to another team while we're continuing to talk about how would we deal with that dependency based on path A, path B, and so on. Keep the team focused on the same thing so that they can keep moving the needle forward together. What you really don't want is a disjointed team where you've got a couple people writing stories, you've got another one that's writing objectives, someone else is over talking dependencies, and we've just lost alignment within the team. If we don't have alignment within the team, we will not have alignment on the plan itself. It just won't happen. I want to show you a couple of guidance articles. And again, this is thanks to John Miller adding this in. He gave a list of some key articles, guidance articles that will help that prepare for art launch. What is it? How do you train the teams? What are PI objectives? PI planning. Please note that PI objectives, team objectives, those terms get used exchanged often. Teams create objectives. That's another key thing to clarify is teams create the objectives. They're not created for them. As they create those objectives and we have business conversations, business owner conversations, get business value, they become part of the art's goal, the objective for the art, and they become PI objectives. What we're trying to accomplish as a art during this PI.